It's lovely to see all of you here. Thank you for showing up on a weekend evening. I know it's a long weekend and I'm sure you have plans. Um, Very happy to be here. I just want to make a slight modification to the introduction that was given, which is that because I work on caste and gender, I'm always tempted to include some new results from something that I've just been working on. And so actually the Claudia Golden bit, I can talk about more through questions and answers, but I'm excited to share some new avenues that I'm exploring in my research on caste and gender. So I'd like to share those with you and get your reaction to that. So overall, looking at male and female labor force participation rates, this graph is from 2004-5 to about 22-23. What you notice is, first of all, over the entire period, and in fact, all the way from independence, female labor force participation rates are consistently lower than male labor force participation rates in rural and urban India. And within female labor force participation rates, urban rates have always been lower than rural rates. The period of the decline is the first part of the graph that you see before the dashed line, which is from 2004-5 and 17-18. And the decline is mainly driven by a decline in female labor force participation rate in rural India. And that's something to remember because the ideas that I want to talk about, the interplay between norms and economic opportunities is contingent on realizing that the decline really happened in rural India. The other point I want you to note is that even if you see the part where the labor force participation is not declining but is actually increasing, which has been the last 4-5 years, it's not dramatic, first of all, the increase, and we can talk about the increase through Q&A later. I'm not going to spend time talking about it. Overall, if you look at just the levels of female labor force participation rates, India records a lower level compared to countries at similar levels of income. So that's another part of this picture, which we can come to a little bit later. Part of it is how it's measured and unpaid work that women do on family farms and enterprises. Part of that low level reflects that. But there's also a more genuine problem about women's involvement in paid work, and so we'll come to that a little bit later. Now, when you look at the literature on the subject, particularly by economists, the low level and the decline are sort of discussed interchangeably as if it's the same thing. Yes, they are two dimensions of the same problem, but the low level and the decline are interrelated but distinct phenomena, and I think they need to be analyzed as such. So let's look at the period when it was declining, between 2004-5 and 17-18. That's a long period of 15 years. A lot was changing in India during those years, right? So for example, education levels of both men and women, particularly women, rose spectacularly during that period. Incomes, India became richer, overall average incomes increased. So you see several other changes that have happened side by side, along with the decline in female participation in paid work. Now, economists talk of the education effect and the income effect. The income effect being, as families become richer, women who are always seen as secondary earners often withdraw from the labor force because in the sort of male breadwinner model of the family, if the man is earning enough, what is the need for the woman to go out and work? That's the way it's seen conventionally. So often you see the operation of the income effect in the sense that as families become richer, women may drop out of paid work, right? So it could be income effect. It could be that the decline is explained by the fact that women were really in colleges and in educational institutions as opposed to being in work, because average years of education for women have increased. And indeed, both of these facts are true. Whether they're responsible for the decline is another matter. But the fact that incomes were rising during the period, education levels were rising, are both true. What was happening to norms? Because we hear a lot about patriarchal norms and in India. So I think we need to sort of understand how norms were changing during the period. And I will show you lots and lots of graphs about norms changing. These are what economists call supply side factors. Why supply side? Because they affect women's ability to supply their labor to the labor market. So it's supply as in labor supply, right? Now, when you think of employment, when you think of people in work, it's a combination of demand and supply. For example, take any company here, let's say Infosys, right? Supposing Infosys posted no openings, we all might be willing to work for Infosys, so we are willing to supply our labor, but if there's no demand for our labor, we are not going to get employed, right? So when you look at employment, it's an interaction between demand and supply. So when you see low levels of female labor force participation, low levels of female employment, just as we focus on the supply side, we also have to ask ourselves, what was happening on the demand side? Could it have been possible that the decline in labor force participation rates that you saw in rural India, might that have been due to the lack of productive employment opportunities in rural India? And if that is the case, then why was there a lack of productive employment opportunities in rural India? What is the relationship between structural change, sectoral change, and labor demand? That's a question that we need to ask ourselves. Okay, so let's look at the supply side factors. Don't worry about the table, it's just a bunch of numbers. But the numbers that I want you to focus on are in the second last row here. So the first number is 17.8. What this is telling you is that the rural female labor force participation rate, which was 50%, 50.6% in 2004-05, declined to 35.5% in 11-12. That's the top row. The contribution of supply side factors to this decline was only 17.8%. Okay, which means over 80% of the decline cannot be explained by the fact that women's education was rising or family incomes were rising. So the education effect and the income effect. The contribution of supply, how I got to these numbers, I'm happy to explain later, but take it from me for now that this follows standard methods that economists use. Between 11-12 and 17-18, the labor force participation rate declined from 35.5 to 24.3, the top row. Only 4.5% of this decline is explained now by supply side factors. So 95% of the decline is not explained by changes in supply side factors. So there's absolutely no denying the fact that supply side factors were changing, but were they explaining the decline in labor force participation rate? That's what this table is trying to tell you, okay? Now, the two most common drivers of labor demand, one is, in countries like ours, in countries like India, one is of course structural change. What does that mean? It means that the economy changes from agriculture being the main contributor to GDP, as well as the biggest employer of people. By agriculture, I mean agriculture and primary activities. So, forestry, fishing, livestock, poultry, etc., orchards, and all of that. So from agriculture and primary activities, the focus shifts to industry, manufacturing, construction, etc., which become important drivers of GDP as well as employment, and then finally to services. So this is a process of development or structural change that all countries in the world have followed. This is historically how economies grow and modernize, all right? That's one thing that you see along with development everywhere in all countries, as well as you see changes in the production technology, right? And what that does is that the occupational composition of employment starts to change as the technology used in production starts to change. So what kinds of jobs die out, what kinds of jobs emerge, and what kinds of tasks are done by hand versus done by machines. So over decades, the sectoral composition of employment, as well as the way through which output and services, commodities and services get produced, both of these things change simultaneously in all societies. That's the way development proceeds. Elsewhere in the world, these changes have contributed to an increase in female labor force participation rate, both for reasons that are the following. That's the service sector in general is supposed to, elsewhere in the world, has high female intensity. A lot of jobs in the service sector are seen as jobs that women can do easily. And as machines start to take away the, sort of the onerous part of the manual work, a lot of jobs that earlier only men used to do because they were just heavy and considered masculine, suddenly those jobs start to be seen as gender neutral or anybody could do. So technology has assisted uh, the involvement of women in paid employment. But in India, you don't see that. Both these factors are also happening in India, but you don't see the sectoral shift as well as the other kinds, the other shifts in the technique of production, technology, leading to an increase in female labor force participation rate. So that's a puzzle, which is not, India is not the only country where you don't see that, but India is one of the few countries where you don't actually observe this increase in female labor force participation rate that accompanies structural change. Okay, so again, this what this graph is showing you is on the vertical axis is female labor force participation rate. On the horizontal axis, agriculture share in employment. And look at this picture backwards. Look at the top right first, right? So that's 93, 94 there. And there are different years. These years correspond to the years in which the surveys, labor force surveys were done. And then you go back I could extend this graph beyond, but I've just kept it up to 17, 18, because that is when the decline happened. So what you see is, as agriculture's share in employment has declined, so has female labor force participation rate. Or in other words, if you wanted to read the graph from left to right, as agriculture's share in employment increases, female labor force participation rate increases, right? And the current increase in female labor force participation rate is also accompanied by an increase in the share of agriculture in total employment. So there is a very strong correlation between female labor force participation rates in India and agriculture share in total employment, because agriculture continues to be the biggest employer of women, agriculture and allied activities, okay? And the period between 2004-5 and 17-18 is when the growth rate of employment in agriculture was negative. Not only what was the growth rate, it wasn't that it was falling, so it was growing but at a slower rate. That's not what was happening. You actually see the line below zero, the blue chart before, dashed line below zero, the rate of growth of employment in agriculture was actually declining. So the total number of people employed in agriculture and allied activities, the total pool was shrinking. And this is exactly the period that the female labor force participation rate declined in India. Right? So there's actually a very strong correlation about the changing nature of agricultural employment, which has to do with demand for female labor, and female labor force participation rate. Okay, so this is just two graphs from a couple of papers that I have, and I'm happy to talk about that more in my conversation with Rosa. But now let me shift to the other part of the story, which is surely norms have something to do with this. Why are you only telling us about supply side, demand side, graphs, figures, numbers, proportions? Surely, we all know that patriarchal norms exist, and surely they have something to do with what we see in the labor market. So there are a few big picture points that I want to make here. First of all, there is nothing called gender norms in India or Indian gender norms. Norms vary hugely across states and across castes, more importantly. So this one size fits all explanation of there is some overarching set of norms that explain everything, that doesn't hold, I don't think that it holds. Because there's a very strong link between caste, the sort of the way the caste system, the grammar of caste, if I may use the title of my book, the way the caste system works, and gender inequalities, let's say, right? So what women are allowed to do and not allowed to do, what is all right and what is not. All of these norms vary a lot by the woman's position in the caste hierarchy, okay? Second, and I have plenty of graphs, and I'm going to only show you a few. Most gendered norms have actually improved over the period where the female labor force participation rate was declining. including the stickiest norm of son preference. So if you look at the sex ratio at birth, it continues to be masculine. It is still not the natural sex ratio at birth, which is 105 boys for every 100 girls born. That should be the natural sex ratio if there was no sex-selective abortion. So it's still not, we are still not there. But after having worsened a lot in the 1980s, in fact, from that period, there's been an improvement in the sex ratio at birth. So even the sticky norm of son preference has started to shift a little bit. The one norm that actually has not changed, and it's the really sticky norm, is the norm that women are predominantly responsible for domestic chores and care work. And by domestic chores, I mean cooking, cleaning, washing dishes, getting clothes washed, house maintenance, fetching the children, getting their homework done, taking care of the parents, in-laws, if you don't have pipe water or pipe gas, fetching the fuel or fetching the water into the house, etc., etc. The list is endless. And this norm is such that women across all caste groups are seen as primarily responsible for this norm. And that results in a situation of a highly unequal division of domestic and care work. So Indian women spend 10 times more hours than men do on all of these tasks put together. And unfortunately, this ratio, we had the first national time use survey in 2019, and we recently had the second one. Unfortunately, the micro data from the second one has not been released, but from the fact sheet, I can see that this ratio has not changed in the 5 years, although 5 years is a small period of time for this to shift, but it hasn't shifted. So to my mind, when I look at low labor force participation rates of women and high levels of time that they have to spend on all of these tasks, domestic chores and childcare, to me, it looks like opposite sides of the same coin. The higher is going to be this burden at home, the lower will be the probability that women will be able to access work if work exists. So there is that big picture question anyway about demand. But supposing there is in fact a sufficient work, this one factor will prevent women from accessing that work if work was available. And adherence to caste norms remains strong. So caste continues to be the arbiter of marriage. More than 95% of marriages in India are arranged according to caste norms. And caste endogamy we take as given. It's just what we do. It's just culture, right? And so caste endogamy is so prevalent that it's almost invisible. We don't even think about it. And that remains, over the decades, that percentage has not changed. Okay, let's just look at how norms, and I've chosen norms that particularly affect women's ability to supply labor. So the younger women get married, the more difficult it's going to be to, be in the labor force. All right, so what is the picture there? So here I've looked at 92, 93 and 2019, 21. This is from National Family Health Survey data. The blue dots are the earlier round and the red dots are the later round. Okay, and what I've done is on the horizontal axis is the states are arranged by how rich the states are. So I've looked at states per capita domestic product, right? And so you find overall that all the states, all the red dots are to the right of the blue dots, basically. So the age at first marriage has increased, and significantly so. There are very few overlaps. I think the only state where I see a little bit of an issue, I think that red dot is Assam, if I'm not mistaken. But overall, the picture is that the age at first marriage, and I've plotted this for every round of the National Family and Health Survey. There are 5 such rounds, and you see a very clear movement over the 5 rounds. So what you see here is a considerable heterogeneity across states. But over time, the trend is clear. The age at first marriage is increasing, okay? And it is how rich the state is. So the state net domestic product per capita does seem to play some role, because if you plot it, if you plot the sort of fit along the state domestic, so richer states do better in this sense. So again, the rich states sort of, for me, it's a proxy for economic opportunity. So economic opportunities are important here. And you do see that playing a role in age at first marriage. Okay. Now you might say, well, age at first marriage, women may not be reporting correctly because maybe they just don't know what age they got married, or maybe they just inflated their age of first marriage. What is very hard to misreport is the age at first childbirth. So you could just look at the age at first childbirth instead of age at first marriage. Again, the picture is almost exactly similar. So you see an upward sloping line. So the richer the states are, the higher is the age at first marriage. This is not causal. It's not saying that growth, because of high levels of income, that is why you have a higher age at first marriage. It could be other way around as well. So this is not about causation. It's about correlation. But you do see a clear correlation between the state domestic product and age at first childbirth. More importantly, you see an increase in the age at first childbirth for all states in India. So there's a clear increase in that. Okay. In National Family Health Survey, women are asked about how much agency they have about taking decisions about their own health care. Right? So are they allowed to think about their own, visiting doctors, or sort of seeking opinion about any ailments that they have? And the answers are classified as full agency, sometimes, never, etc. There are 4 categories. And if you look at the always and almost always, if you look at those answers, so I've classified that as women having agency, in having some say in their own healthcare, decisions about their own healthcare. And again, you see the same pattern here. Between 98, 99 and 29, 21, you see women's self-reported agency in deciding about their own healthcare has improved across all states in India. Okay. There's a question about, are you allowed to visit families, friends and relatives? Okay. So this is about female autonomy in sort of going out and being mobile. Again, the same picture. All of these have been plotted with state net domestic product on the horizontal axis. So you sort of see a picture also in relation to how rich the state is. And so again, you see an upward sloping curve here. So the pattern remains similar. But again, this is women's own reported agency in going out of the house to visit family and friends. That has improved. All of these, there are many, I have about 12, 13 norms. I'm not going to show you figures for all of them. I've chosen the ones that I think are most relevant from the point of view of labor force participation. Right? If women can decide about their own healthcare, if women are free to step out of the house to meet family and friends, if they are having children at a later age, all of these are indicators that they would be more likely to be in the labor force if the opportunities presented themselves. Okay. Education gap between spouses. The very interesting feature about India is that the education gap between spouses has been declining over time. In fact, there is now a paper using IHDS data, written by the creator of the IHDS, Professor Desai, Sonal Desai. She talks about educational hypogamy, which is that wives on average today are more educated than their husbands on average. So that's just IHDS data. But regardless, the spousal gap between, the education gap between spouses has been declining. This also has implications for female labor force participation, because the larger the gap, the more educated the husband is in relation to the wife, the less power the wife is going to have in terms of, expressing her say, etc. So this is again another picture that we need to be mindful of. Okay. So this is overall without bringing in the caste picture into the caste system into the picture. But as you know, gender hierarchies and caste hierarchies are inextricably linked. And I don't have time to go into the why of it so much in the talk, but I do want to take some proxies for the strength of caste norms. And one of the proxies is the data set that I referred to a little bit in the previous slide, the India Human Development Survey, of which 2 rounds are available, and the third one is being done, but it's not available with us. And in the second round of the IHDS, in the India Human Development Survey, people were asked 2 questions. One, do you practice untouchability? You just have to say yes or no. All right. And the second one was, would you allow someone from any caste background to come into your kitchen and use your kitchen utensils? And again, you have to say yes or no to that question. So you can code, if people said yes to either of those questions, you can say that they believe in untouchability. Now, obviously, as we all know, untouchability is illegal. Nobody is legally speaking an untouchable. Yet, overt and covert practices of untouchability continue. And the remarkable thing about this survey is that this was done in 2011 and 12. So after all those years of untouchability being illegal, the national average of people who reported to practice untouchability was 30%. And this must be an underestimate, because when you know something is illegal, you're not going to admit that you practice it, even if you actually practice it, right? So these are the new graphs because of which I removed Claudia Golden's work, which I have just started working, and I've been thinking about looking at gender norms in terms of how strong caste norms are. So the question that I'm asking myself is, are the states in which caste norms are strong, are those the states that show more unequal gender norms, right? So this is just very preliminary, but I thought, since I've literally last week, I started working on it, so I thought I'll show you some new graphs. And so what I've plotted here is a sun preference, which is the difference between the ideal number of, so in the National Family Health Survey data, which was a source for the earlier graphs, women are asked, what is the ideal number of sons you want to have? And what is the ideal number of daughters you want to have? Okay, and the difference in that number is an indicator of son preference. If the number of sons is greater than the number of daughters, ideally speaking, then you have a son preference. So this is just that indicator. And so I plotted at the state level the son preference, which if it is above 0, which means you want more sons than daughters, side by side with proportion of people in that state admitting to practicing untouchability using the other data set, IHDS. And you see a positive correlation. Again, this is just a correlation. You can't conclude too much from it, but it's just eye-opening for me, which is that the states in which the practice of untouchability is the highest are also states, not all, but many of them are states that show a greater son preference. Okay, so there is some, there was always historically a very clear correlation between caste norms and gender norms, but it seems to be the case that we still have that kind of a correlation. Okay. Then I use that question about how, are you allowed to visit families and friends, etc. So women's mobility agency against untouchability practice, same variables. And here again, you see that states that have higher self-reported individuals practicing untouchability are states where women's mobility agency is lower. Okay. So when we focus on gender norms, maybe we should be focusing on caste norms, really. This is again correlation. It's not a perfect 45-degree line or anything like that, but there is some sort of a correlation here. Okay. So this is one avenue that I'm working on right now, which is looking at self-reported practices of untouchability. And unfortunately, this can only be done at the state level because IHDS data doesn't, is not big enough for us to look at the district level, because states in India are massive, even districts are very large. But, I would want to do a more granular analysis at the district level. So then I started thinking of, okay, what can I look at the district level, which will also capture caste norms in some way? And the idea occurred to me when the recent consumption expenditure survey came out, although the graphs I'm going to show you are from the earlier consumption expenditure survey, because that I had already looked at, so I had those numbers. But I'm going to repeat that now with the 23-24 consumption expenditure survey. So based on the consumption expenditure survey, you can calculate the proportion of individuals who spend any amount on eggs, on fish, or on any non-veg excluding eggs and fish. I mean, it's up to you what you want to calculate, okay? And so at this you can do at the district level because the survey is much larger. So I did a heat map of proportion of non-SC, ST, OBC Hindus that eat, I have three diet norms. One is eat any non-veg, including eggs. One is eat, because eggs many people eat, so I just removed eggs and just put fish. And the third one is excluding eggs and fish, because many people in the coastal areas eat fish and don't think of it as, strictly speaking, non-veg, or it's permitted by caste norms. And so I looked at non-SC, ST, OBC Hindus eating non-fish, non-egg, non-veg. So basically meats, chicken and meats of different kinds, right? And this is a district level heat map of that proportion. The lighter shades are low proportions and the darker is high proportion, right? So this is what the diet chart looked like in 2011-12, and I'm going to now repeat this with 23-24 very soon. So this was eye-opening for me because I had not expected. I thought most of it would be light, because now I'm taking a very strict definition of being non-veg, right? Eating meats, not just fish and eggs, and focusing only on the Hindu population and focusing only on the non-SC, ST, OBC population. So I thought that's mostly, my expectation was that this graph is going to be mostly yellow, but it's not, first of all, right? So I don't know how this has changed over time. I mean, that would be interesting to see how this has varied, but this was just a one-time snapshot. So I said, okay, why don't I do the same thing now with this proportion of, with this diet norm that I just showed you earlier in the graph, right? And if you take that as so the higher the proportion eating what I showed you earlier, higher the proportion of non-SC, ST, OBC Hindu population eating meat, you take that as some sort of loosening of caste norms, supposing you were to make that argument, then again you have the greater the proportion, the lower is the sun preference, broadly speaking. Again, not a very tight causation here, but sort of broadly speaking, the line is downward sloping, but it's a little bit all over the place. So you could say that, well, you're making too much out of this, this particular graph. You could say that and I'll accept it. But I want to show you something else beyond this. So I'm not going to only focus on this graph. Okay, and the same thing then I did with Women's Mobility Agency. And again, you sort of see an upward sloping line, some sort of a positive correlation between what I am taking as a proxy for loosening caste norms and women's ability to move outside their home to visit relatives and friends, right? So there's again some, if you combine the evidence from the untouchability data, you combine the evidence from the diet data, there seems to be some evidence that the looser the caste norms, the better are the gender norms in some sense, right? So then I decided to just test this a little bit further, and again, this is preliminary. And what I've done here is I've run a regression here, and anytime any of those lines cross zero, it means that there is no relationship, right? So I don't think you can see the dashed lines, but just imagine, on my graph, I can see the line. Imagine, draw a line from zero horizontally in your mind, and you will see that in this particular case, only the age at first, female age at first birth. So the three diet norms are, the first one is proportion of Hindu population that eats anything other than eggs, including fish, all Hindu population. The second one, the second line with the diamond, is the proportion of Hindu population that eats meats, all Hindu population, including SC, ST, OBC. And the third one is non-SC, ST, OBC population that eats anything other than eggs and fish, which according to me is the strictest indicator of loosening of caste norms. Sorry if I'm making it a bit complicated. And so what you see in the last bit, which is age at first birth, and here I control for regional dummies, so these are characteristics of the region that don't change over time, so you take into account that. And if you look at the first one, which is proportion of Hindu population that eats fish and meat, all Hindu population, the greater that is, on female education, spousal age gap, so female education is higher, spousal age gap is higher, and spousal education gap is lower. Age at first birth, two of those things cross zero, so the effect is a little bit weaker. But overall, the first three norms, you see a very clear correlation, which is statistically significant. in between caste, loosening of caste norms and um, and female norms indicators, with diets as a proxy for caste norms. This is more, these are more. And so now here you see female labor force participation rate also. There's female labor force participation rate, son preference. I'll talk about the middle one in a minute. And then there's the agency questions, female, going out of the house mobility agency and the health agency. So all of these are better where in districts where this is district level. So in districts where proportions eating any meat, so it's some loosening of diet restrictions, you see that is better. The only thing that's worse is the justification for domestic violence. And this, by the way, you see very clearly, we are doing this talk in Bangalore. The National Family Health Survey has a question which gives 7 reasons why a man might be justified in beating his wife, including burning the roti, getting the children late from school, etc., etc. And there are 7 questions, and what I did was I coded it as they justify domestic violence if they said yes to any of those reasons, if any of those was justified in their view. And actually, the justification for domestic violence is higher in southern states than it is in northern states. And it has gone up in the NFHS rounds. So it's again an anomaly. I don't know the answer to it, and I'm discovering it right now. So I have to still think about it. But so that, barring that, so this is justification, not actual domestic violence. The justification of domestic violence, which becomes worse with both with development, because the southern states are in fact richer and perform better on almost all other gender indicators, but they also have greater justification for domestic violence. Okay, so now let me step back and go a little international and look at India's performance in the sphere of female labor force participation rate in an international perspective. So I've taken a snapshot in 1971. Okay, so by the way, I don't know if you remember, but that the proportion that supply side explains, that table, if you paid attention, then you will notice that in 2004-05, the rural Indian female labor force participation rate was 50%, right? So when we talk about norms, we also have to remember that not so long ago, it was actually 50%. And these are some numbers in 1971 from developed countries, which today have much higher female labor force participation rates. So just in 1971, US had a rate of 43.6, UK 42.7, Australia 39.95, France 39.42, Germany 38.78. Now, I haven't come across a single paper or a book that talks about patriarchal gender norms being responsible for these low rates of female labor force participation rate. This is what was seen as normal at that time. And although norms were patriarchal, but the use of the norms framework to describe what we see in India was not so often used when we saw similar trends in countries that are present-day developed countries. When they had rates that were similar, we are at 38% right now, but we have a ton of explanations which are norms-based. But when you look at UK at 42 or US at 43, Australia at 39.5, there were no norms-based explanations. It was all about, are there jobs for women? Things like that. At most, there was talk about domestic work, but not really. So it was not a norms-based analysis. It was more a question of gender discrimination at the workplace, etc. Very clear economic factors, social factors that I think we should be also talking about. Not so much in the context of norm, but this was the picture. And this sort of puts I'm not saying that India doesn't need to improve. Of course it needs to. But what I'm trying to say is that maybe explaining everything to norms may not be the answer, because when we saw these rates in these countries, we were not explaining them through norms. By we, I mean people who were writing at that time. Okay. If you look at the OECD data, and I've now looked at a lot of it, which because I'm working on norms, etc. Despite the OECD countries have nearly 70 years of increasing female labor force, FLFP. You look at gender gaps in many arenas, decision-making spaces, CEO positions, boardrooms, etc., etc. So gender gaps in many wage gaps, most of all, and discrimination against women continue to prevail, despite the fact that female labor force participation rate has been consistently increasing. So my point is that while we definitely must talk about increasing female labor force, FLFP, we should not be under the illusion, because history tells us that we should not be under the illusion that just by increasing female labor force participation rates, automatically gender gaps are going to start to reduce. Not at all. They haven't happened anywhere in the world. So we must, all of these other factors will continue to be important, whether it's gender wage gaps, whether it's misogyny, glass ceiling, sexism, all kinds of things, right? And those countries, the very rich countries that have very high labor force participation rates, female labor force participation rates, have not solved these problems yet. They continue to be very prevalent. And in the United States, we are witnessing a lot of sort of a rollback of many of the rights that women had earned through decades of struggle. Okay, this is a sort of more than 100-year picture. Up to 1980, this data was available from Our World in Data using Time Use survey data. I got my student to extend this to 2020. So the extension of this graph, my student has done. And so what this is showing is weekly hours dedicated to home production. By home production, I mean all the domestic chores. And you see from 1900 to about 1970, 1980, you see a decline in the number of hours that women spend. And you see an increase in the number of hours that men spend. So first of all, in every year, every decade, women spend more time than men, which is exactly what we see in India as well. But at least in a period of 80, 90 years, you see a clear decline. But that decline has stalled now. From 1980 onwards, there's practically no change in the gender gap. And certainly, while male hours are increasing, female hours have remained stuck. And during COVID, we saw an expression of that. When women dropped out of the labor force in the United States because working from home, even when they could work from home, but working from home meant that they were also responsible for the homeschooling and the care of the children, which was such an onerous job that they were not able to keep up. And many women dropped out of the labor force during COVID, even when they had not been laid off. They had their jobs, but they dropped out, right? And so this picture also is a kind of a cautionary tale, which is India is off the charts as far as this division is concerned. So we absolutely have to figure out ways of reducing the gap. But even after 100 years or so, the gap still remains substantial. And there could be a point where it doesn't change. And now, the next 5 years, we don't know what's going to happen as, many social attitudes in the US are changing. The trend of what are called trad wives or traditional wives is sort of gaining ascendance. The fact that, all this modernization and feminism and all of this was wrong. Women should basically be homemakers and taking care of the children, etc. This tendency is now, pretty strong in certain segments of the American population. So we don't know what it will show up as later on. Let's come to intimate partner violence or domestic violence. It's not just intimate partner violence, but domestic violence. And we talked about justification for domestic violence. And of course, when you always see numbers on domestic violence, you have to be a little careful about how to interpret them. First of all, these are underestimates because many women don't report domestic violence. So that's everywhere, not just in India. Secondly, when you see a high number, there's always a question about, is it high rates of incidence, or is it that women are reporting more? So imagine a society where domestic violence is very prevalent, but women are afraid to report. So then you won't see these numbers, right? Regardless, let's assume it's incidence because you cannot disentangle easily the incidence versus reported issue in domestic violence. And India is on the higher end of the spectrum. So these are OECD countries and India. So what I did was I went to the OECD website, took the data from OECD, and I put in India's data just to see where India lies on the spectrum. And India definitely lies on the higher end. But there are OECD countries, which is far richer countries, that have greater, you can't read these numbers, so the red line is India, and you see there are countries that report higher proportions of intimate partner violence. So nothing to be proud of for any country. Any country that reports this data, there's nothing to be proud of at all. But the point is that when we talk about social norms, and if domestic violence is an indicator, one of those social norms, what you see is a continuum here. Not that some countries have crossed that barrier and are just the other side of the divide, and countries like India and some others are on this really bad side of the divide. You don't see that. So the point that I make about norms is, of course, norms are important. Of course, there are gendered norms in all countries, but I see them as a continuum rather than as some countries with good norms and some countries with bad norms. India being one of the countries with bad norms, I cannot see that picture at all, right? And even in India, as you see, and I have many more graphs which are not on this slide deck, where norms have improved. So we have to rethink the role of norms in terms of explaining a lot of gendered outcomes. So this is my last slide. So from the supply side, my own understanding is that the heavy burden of what feminists call reproductive labor, which includes all the domestic work and care work, from the supply side, that's the chief barrier uh, for women to access employment. But despite this very heavy load of reproductive labor, women's willingness to work, and by work I mean paid work, to be in the labor force, women's willingness to work is high. There are surveys after surveys, including those done by the government, done privately. I have myself done a couple of surveys, and you see when women are asked, if work was to be made available near your home, would you take it up? Why near your home? Because of the previous bullet point, which is high rate of, high heavy responsibility of domestic labor. And the second point is that when work does become available, with all the difficulties and all the difficulties of combining domestic work with paid work, women take it up. So, and I have another paper which shows that women enter and exit the labor force several times. The same woman enters and exits depending on when work is available. I'm talking about very precarious kind of work, not salaried work like many of us are engaged in. Okay, so what we have to think of is creating a demand for labor, which is generating employment. Now, the cart before the horse part comes in here, which is if you look at the international attention, whether it's academics, whether it's media, whether it's funding agencies, the World Bank, Gates Foundation, all of these, the entire attention is, this mega bucks being poured into shifting norms. So there are programs, there are training programs, there are interventions, there are experiments that are saying, okay, let's first shift norms. Once norms shift, then women will get into paid work. I would say use that money to generate employment. Use that money to create labor-intensive, rural, non-farm employment opportunities close to where the women are and close to where the men are, honestly, so that women can take up the work. So the fact that women should be in paid work, if they want to be, of course, is not under doubt. The question is, are we putting the cart before the horse? Because in no country in the world, norms change because in no country in the world, and that's Claudia Golden's work here, which is when she documents the increase in employment for college-educated US women. She said that happened when actually jobs started to become available for these women. That's when they left the home and they started going out. Not that miraculously their husbands and decided, okay, now you must do less housework, let me also contribute. Now that your housework burden is reduced, now you can go out and look for work. It didn't happen that way. So the norms changed, that graph that we saw in the US, Golden attributes it to the fact that women actually left the home and started going to paid work. That's when men stepped up. Or they started using machines, washing machine, or whatever else, microwaves and all of these things, labor-saving devices that allowed women to combine domestic work and also go out and in paid employment. So norms shift in response to economic incentives, in response to material conditions, not the other way around. Change in norms doesn't change material conditions or economic incentives. And I think that's the cart before the horse argument that I'm making, which is the entire attention of the policy world is on focusing on norms change. And academics are guilty, in the same way, which is let's focus on norms change. Once people start thinking differently, then the economic opportunities will change. It's the opposite. First, economic opportunities will change, then people will start thinking differently. China went from foot binding to 80% labor force participation rate for women. Did that happen because some emperor woke up one day and said, okay, foot binding is a really cruel practice and I don't think Chinese women's feet should be bound? Or were there other changes that happened in China that resulted in that shift? South Korea, Vietnam, these countries have seen spectacular increases in female labor force participation rates, not because of change of norm. Norms have changed in response to the increase in female labor force participation rate, not because first norms change, then female labor force participation rates change. Of course, there are barriers to work, which are very, very significant. One, of course, I talked about reproductive labor. Secondly, lack of decent, fast, and safe transportation. If you're going to spend 2 hours, one each way, going to work and back, that doesn't work. It doesn't work for anyone, but especially doesn't work for women. Um, Childcare, elderly care, all of these are issues that need to be moved out of the family to think of how we socialize care and socialize the care economy, for which you have to take one step back and recognize that women do all this work. It's only when you recognize can you think of redistributing or reducing this kind of work. And this is when men and women should be able to access work within commuting distance, right? So these are very, very important barriers, but I see them as demand side barriers, not really. I mean, I know it affects women's supply of labor, but these are fixed from the demand side, not through norms change. And this is the lesson from history. I've looked at Claudia Golden's work, I've looked at other people's work. Where women enter paid work in large numbers, norms inside the home begin to change, although very slowly, as we saw in the graph from the United States. So this is it. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashwini. That was a fascinating lecture and lot for us to think about. I want to actually start off with where you concluded, which is on the policies question. So I think one of the things that, how policy has kind of tried to address it, at least in the Indian context, has been to facilitate women's entry into the workforce. So, for example, and all of these are sometimes, well-intentioned policy, but sometimes having slightly counterproductive results. So, for example, with the Maternity Benefits Act, so in 2017, the Maternity Benefits Act was amended to allow for longer number of weeks for women out of the workforce, basically paid leave. And there's been studies that subsequently showed that that policy, however well-intentioned, finally resulted in a decline in women's employment. So on the one hand, you've spoken about the importance of policy to generate employment. You've also spoken about this idea of a sticky norm, which is especially so when it comes to childcare and reproductive labor. How do we think of policies in an Indian context with this very sticky norm? And what has been the experience, based on your analysis of other countries as well, what has been ways in which policies and state support has worked to facilitate women in the workforce?
Yeah. Thanks, Rosa. So you absolutely correctly pointed out that both childcare leave and maternity leave, and including now, when they've started to allow night shift work for women, what they're saying is that the employers are responsible for dropping the women home safely, which leads to a situation where employers say, we don't want to hire women because we cannot take responsibility for their safety. So it's a well-meaning policy, but again, it can have some counterproductive results. So I would say a couple of different things. So one is, we have to think of the structure of, when you just think of non-farm enterprises, if you look at the Indian scenario, what you have are either very tiny enterprises where the median number of workers is literally 2, which is basically just family and maybe one hired worker, or you have the formal corporate sector, which in Bangalore you see a lot of, right? And so I think policies cannot be the same for the two type of sectors. So one thing that I've learned from just the work that SEDA has been doing in terms of talking to employers is that large firms if the top leadership of the large firms is on board, then you can actually get them to institute several factors without affecting adversely the demand for female labor. But the same solutions will not work for a small employer, because small employers don't have, even if you think of an enterprise that hires, let's say, 10 people or 5 people, right? Where is that employer going to be able to give maternity leave for 6 months to a woman, right? And so, if you leave it all to the employers, there will always be a problem, particularly in the kind of production structure that, in terms of size, I mean, the size distribution of Indian enterprises. If you leave it only to the employer, there will always be an issue, because you will not have full compliance, first of all, and secondly, when a large, the left tail of the distribution, as it were, is not going to be able to comply, even if hypothetically they were willing to comply, right? So I think there the role of the state and possibly public-private partnership comes in, right? So there have been models in other countries where maybe the sort of the capex was provided by the state, so the building and the first structure was provided for the state, but then it was leased to some private agency to run. So let's say a daycare center or something like that, right? Or you could have purely state-provided services. But one thing that happens in India again, and we have to be cognizant of this fact, which is that whenever it's a completely state-provided service, there's a class divide that emerges, right? The middle class and upwards will never use that service. So how can we think of whether it is maternity benefits, whether it is childcare, elderly care, vaccination, early childhood support, help with kids' education, or sports facilities. I mean, these are all the things that keep parents occupied and engaged and anxious. Not all the things, there's some of the things that keep parents occupied. What the feminist says, the care economy. I think that if you look at every question in itself, it is an insurmountable problem. But if you think of the care economy that encompasses a range of services, that the responsibility of which is not on the employer, that's a possible way out. But again, there has to be a lot of recognition first, which is that this is a problem that needs to be solved. Because typically when we've been speaking to employers, their point is why? Why women? It's running fine. Our company is running fine. Why do we want the added headache of employing women? I mean, Indulekha is here. We just did a report on returnship. Now, these are women who are older, who took a career break when they were getting married or having kids. Now their kids are a little bit older. They themselves realize that they can get back to paid work. They are willing to get back to paid work. They want to get back to paid work. But how do they get back? Where do they find the match with with their employers? How can we convince the employers to look at this constituency of women, the older women, to be in the paid work? So we focus a lot on entry-level hiring, and all the discussion also about, even academics, we just tend to focus on entry level, and it's an important point, I'm not saying that. But there is a very significant constituency of older women who actually face fewer of these barriers, and they are willing to get in. So if you think that increasing participation of women in work is important, in paid work is important, then you could perhaps consider a bunch of different things. One, of course, what I said earlier, which is creating jobs close to home. That's the one thing. But then even when you think of the corporate sector, the industrial, manufacturing, all of this, financial services, other kinds of IT services, etc., then you have to think of how can you create the care economy in a way that the entire burden of providing these services is not on the employer. I'm not exonerating the employers. I just know that they're not going to do it, right? But if you want to get it done, then you think creatively. Some employers would be willing to do it, and they are, in fact. Wipro, for example, has a very good returnship policy, right? And it also has very sort of female-friendly policies at the workplace. But large organizations with a certain kind of vision are able to do it. But that's not your typical case. So I think gender bias at the workplace is very real, and I'm not talking about the formal sector, the large enterprises in the formal sector, and that definitely needs to be tackled. And it's not going to be easy. There will always be pushback. Why women? We are doing fine, you know. Why do you want to complicate the situation now by saying, okay, hire women or hire this or hire that? So why not business as usual? So I think that's a struggle. But to be aware of policies that can have a counterproductive impact, I think is a very, very important point.
Thanks. I actually want to, I think I really like how you separate the sort of the demand and the supply side story. And I think, at least in academia, we are starting to get separated into two camps in a sense, the demand side camp and the supply side
Yes.
camp. And I don't know, I'm still sitting on the fence, and I
Yes.
think maybe, but I just want to understand, is it an either or question, right? So you have evidence that shows that women who are married, lower employment rates. I mean, it's simple cross-section of evidence. But you also have evidence that shows, I mean, so you have these studies by Dhivadar and others who show that, when in these
Marriage.
matrimony, marriage portfolios, when women expressed a desire to work after marriage, they were far likely to get suitors and, marriage suitors. And so you have this idea that, and that those are highly educated women. So we still have a pool of highly educated women who are probably being educated for the marriage market. Whereas this idea that women can work, should work, doesn't exist. So in that sense, it speaks towards this sort of supply side norm story.
Yeah.
And I just want to know where you stand. Is it an either or question? And how do you reconcile these two things?
First, it's not an either or question. So that's just a simple one line answer. The reason that I'm a demand sider, as it were, in the camps, I know I'm very aware of these camps. I keep getting messages sometimes. We are on your side in this debate. So it's happy to have people on my team. No, but it's not. It's not an either or question. It can never be. I don't think so. But if you think of the demand supply as a loop, which is going on these interlocking loops. My question is, it's a vicious cycle. At how do you break the vicious cycle? That's where I think demand is important. The other reason I push for demand is because uh, the demand siders, and certainly I, recognize the importance of supply side factors. But I'm not sure that the pure supply side factors ever talk about demand. It's all about the individual woman and her husband and the family. And if you read a lot of these interventions, they're exclusively targeted towards the woman and her friend. If you take a friend with you to the bank, you will get a better loan or something like that. Sure, I'm not denying that. Yeah, sure, if you have somebody to go with you, things will be better for you. So there's no denying that evidence at all. But therefore, will it result in more women taking up entrepreneurship? I don't know. Right? So that's where. So I think that recognizing that both demand and supply matter is what I would argue as the first thing. The second thing is that's why I started delving into history to see, after all, the countries that we today think of as having progressive norms, they didn't have these progressive norms. Does anyone know in the United States when women could get credit cards in their own name without a male guarantor? Yeah, which year was it? Roughly 70s, 1975. So in 1975, when we are studying, look at data today, we think of the cross-sectional snapshot. So you think of the US today, the UK today, Scandinavia today. Think of just 50 years ago. It was not at all like what it was. So in 75, women actually before 75, could not apply for a credit card without a male guarantor. Many of the very prestigious universities that are the sort of beacons of knowledge and all the rest of it did not admit women until much later, right? And so somehow we don't use the word norms to describe all of these gender biases. So my sort of the reason that I keep pushing this saying look elsewhere, not just at norms, is because I think that there is patriarchy which takes different forms in different settings and in different times. Even in one given country, it doesn't take the same form. I think it evolves and uh, but and we all, and I don't think there's any country that's sort of post-patriarchal, right? And so, but how did And I think the weakening of patriarchy is not a linear trend as the US is showing us right now. So there's going to be many steps forward and several steps back, and then again many steps forward. Uh, uh, but how did those changes, how did the changes that we consider progressive, how did those changes happen? Did they happen because people started saying, okay, I think these patriarchal norms are wrong and you should please abandon these? Or did people abandon them because they started it started to make sense to them? I mean, take the for example, the average number of children that Indian women have today, it's gone down to 2.1, which is the replacement rate. In urban India, it's 1.9. Certain communities and certain states, it's even less than that. It's less than replacement level. My grandmother had 8 children from my mother's side, and it was very common in her at her time to have 8, 10 children. So basically, throughout your reproductive life, you keep having children, right? So this was her life, and it was the life of all the women in her generation. Today, just the word 8 children just will it's unthinkable, right? How did this norm change? Were there norm changing interventions? Did people go and start telling people having, yeah, I mean, there were government campaigns and all that, but the real change occurred because of the spectacular investment in public health that India achieved despite its low level of income, which drastically reduced infant mortality and maternal mortality. If the probability of your children growing up to adulthood is high, you don't feel the need to have so many children. And so it's happened. I mean, some people might take credit, oh, we had those advertising campaigns because of which this norm changed, but it's not because of the advertising campaigns. When I was in school, there was this advertising campaign which said hum do hamare do, everywhere it used on buses and everywhere. And so somebody may say, oh, it's because of that campaign that people started thinking differently. I don't think so. I think people realized as the material circumstances, their material circumstances changed. You don't really need 8 children. If you want 2 healthy children as grown-ups, you just produce the two, right? So I think that looking at how norms have changed gives us a lot of clue about how they will change in the future.
You almost convinced me to move to the other side, but no.
It's good to have some debate.
Yeah. No, you have convinced me pretty much. My one final question before I open it up to the audience. So I think, I mean, and you showed this in one of your early slides, was this increase in female labor force participation in the last few years. And we've seen it rise quite high and reach almost the 2004-5 levels. And a lot has been written about it. And you've also spoken about how possibly some of that increase, if you look at it in detail, it may not signal a great thing for women and integrating them into the economy. And in that, one is I would like you to speak about what that recent increase means, what are the implications for this. But then do we also need to move beyond this metric of FLFP, given that sometimes it's often not correlated to decision making, autonomy, agency? And then what is it that we should be looking at when we are thinking about integrating women into the economy?
No, so the second point first, absolutely, we have to. FLFP is just one of the many indicators that we looked
I
at.
think maybe we should clarify because we use FLFP very
Female
casually.
labor force participation rate, FLFPR to be precise. So female labor force participation rate. So this entire obsession with this one metric, which is also actually part of the reason why the supply side explanation sounds to be the right one, because labor force participation is a binary indicator, which means you're either in the labor force or you're out of the labor force, right? And it sounds like it must have to do with an individual's decision to be in the labor force. So if you're not in the labor force, it must be because you don't want to be, right? And although you could not be in the labor force because maybe you didn't, you realize that there were no jobs available, so it's just not worth your time looking for a job. And in fact, that point that you made about getting educated to get a better marriage match, it might make more sense for women to say, okay, I'll get a degree so that at least I get a partner who can then, with whom I can think of a life, rather than aimlessly trying to look for work. And so they may just opt out if there is a paucity of jobs. So there's that also happens. But female labor force participation rate is just one of the several indicators that characterize women's work both inside the home and outside the home. And this obsession with that single number sometimes makes us forget that there are all of these other dimensions. And that was in my last slide where I talked about gender gaps and all of this. And that's where, in fact, you see, if you look at the OECD countries, the richest countries in the world, female labor force participation rate is not their problem. That's high. Yet, they have so many gender gaps in a range of indicators related to women's work. So, they don't talk about increasing female labor force participation rates. They talk about other things, right? And I think those things are also important for India, and I think we should be talking about them. Coming now to the first part of your question. So, if you look at the increase in this rate from about 17, 18 to present, it's continuously been increasing. So, the early couple of years was basically just counting the women who were working on family enterprises, farms or kirana shops or making good or pickle or whatever it is, just counting their work a little more accurately, because the not 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 changes in classification, because Mr. Mohanan, who was in the National Statistical Commission, has written a very nice piece in the India Forum where he challenges this idea that somehow they just changed the classification and suddenly they started increasing. He shows that in fact that's not the case. But the National Statistical Office shifted from a pen and paper interview to a computer assisted interview. They made some streamlining of the questions, and they were able to better pick up this unpaid, not domestic work, but women's work on family end. But that was only the first couple of years. After that, the category that has seen an increase is self-employed women. And self-employment is a very generic term. It picks up literally anything. So if you sit outside in the street and start selling tea, you are self-employed, right? So it often picks up very precarious, very low productivity, survivalist, bottom of the ladder work, which people do to just stay alive and just to earn some livelihood, right? And that has increased. So you don't see an increase in earnings of the self-employed, but you see an increase in women classifying themselves as self-employed. So which basically means that women are out there doing something to earn a living, not that they're earning. So it's not a transformative move by any stretch of the imagination. And so I think we need to focus attention on earnings, on conditions of work, on precarity, all of these features of work, and go beyond FLP. And finally, remember that graph that I showed, the correlation between female labor force participation rate and share of agriculture in total employment? The structural transformation of the economy, which meant the share of agriculture in total employment was declining through the decades. COVID and after, it has started to increase again. So it's a little bit of a reversal of the structural transformation. And some of the increase is just women working on farms and, that.
Okay, we'll open it up for questions. One of my colleagues will come around with a mic. Just a few announcements before we open it up. In the interest of time, we have about 15 minutes, so one question per person. Please do not preface your questions with massive comments and paragraphs. Just keep it brief and to the point. And finally, we may not be able to accommodate all questions, so please, apologies in advance, please bear with us.
So you covered all the interesting points, and one thing maybe you can add is how the policy is the key change maker, right? Like even the taxation, family taxation and all can encourage more women to work, and healthcare you covered, but is government asking the right questions? Are we just putting entire blame on women to empower them, and instead of empowering government, like government should put some good policies, right? Is anything happening in that place?
I mean, if you ask the government, yes, they are putting forward policies. What can I say?
No, but maternity is counterintuitive, as you said. These policies are actually hindering the growth. Right?
Maternity leave is applicable to a very tiny fraction of enterprises in India, very tiny fraction. So majority of the enterprises in India are not covered by maternity leave rules because they are too small. So even this reversal, this counter is just applicable to a tiny segment. And as we discussed, I mean, there are many, many more policies that that are important. And I think one thing you mentioned, taxation, what I want to talk about now, you know, you see the tariff war that's going to happen with the United States. If India's exports in sectors that have high female representation, let's say apparel or whatever else might be, if those exports suffer, then it's going to have a consequence on female labor force participation as well. So we don't even think about tariffs and trade as female labor force participation related issues. You think of them as trade or macro and things like that, but your overall taxation policy, your overall trade patterns, they also determine female labor force participation rates. So, I mean, not that can be reversed by a policy of the Indian government, but I think we need to be cognizant of impact of wider macro and trade policies on female labor force participation rates.
So you mentioned precarity in work. Even in agriculture, like women participate in agriculture, but a lot of work that is designated would be weeding and transplanting, which is very precarious and a repetitive process in nature. So the correlation between agriculture practiced and women's participation in the labor force, how can we look deeper into it with that keeping in mind like what kind of work or quality of work?
Yeah, so female labor force participation rate is just that one indicator that does not looking at quality of work. That's just the proportion of women who are in the labor force. That's all that I was trying to show. If you go specifically at agriculture, my colleague Kanika Mahajan at Ashoka has a paper that shows that mechanization in agriculture has actually contributed to a decline in female labor force participation rates because tasks that are traditionally considered feminine in agriculture are getting mechanized more compared to tasks that are considered masculine. So women's ability to work in agriculture is actually adversely affected by mechanization. That's not to say that mechanization shouldn't happen, but it's to say that we need to be aware of this feature.
I just wanted to get back to a question of in large data that you're using, you use proxies for women's interests or the breakdown of patriarchy. But even if you take the female labor force participation rate, the assumption that it's necessarily a positive feature is lost in agriculture. Because agriculture, the women's participation in agriculture is a part of an extremely backward, patriarchal and exploitative system. But you're using it as an indicator of women's liberation in a way. The second proxy that I think I would just like you to consider is that on diet. Because at least from, you take a caste like the Okligas in Karnataka or the Modliars in Tamil Nadu, and I can go on. A large number of the non-Brahmin upper castes are traditionally very, very non-vegetarian. Even it's a part of their festivals also. So to treat that as an indicator of the weakening of caste may be worth consideration.
Yeah, so I think I completely understand that just because the woman is in the labor force doesn't necessarily mean that it's an empowering scenario for her. That absolutely goes without saying. And in fact, you see now, there have been this is not coming through macro data, but there have been some ethnographic studies done by sociologists in Tamil Nadu, and I'm familiar with one study in Tamil Nadu, that looks at Dalit women who from families that have experienced some upward mobility. And those women have withdrawn from the labor force because their point is all the women in our, for generations have always been working outside the home. So the luxury of not working was never available to us, right? And so they withdrew. So they see it through a totally different lens. So I think there again you have to look at the caste norms. This picture that I showed was not weakening or strengthening. It wasn't. It was just at a point in time, different districts. So you look at districts where proportions eating meat are higher versus districts where proportions eating meat are lower. That's it. And do you see any, this was just a curiosity on my part, honestly. And I was prepared to see no correlation. It just happens to be the case that I saw a correlation, which then I subsequently confirmed through regressions, but maybe it'll go away if I put more controls. It's possible. Sorry to be a little technical, but it's possible that what I'm seeing is a spurious correlation, that it's actually something else that I'm picking up, and I will be happy to revise it. But I was literally last week I was working on it, so I found the diet charts interesting, so I decided to share them with you. But I take your point that this is not the most absolutely perfect measure of the strength of caste norms. I take that completely. So I would regard actually the untouchability, the self-reported practice of untouchability, a better measure, but that I can only do at the state level, not at the district level.
Thank you, Dr. Deshpande, for that very enlightening lecture.
Oh, here.
Yes. I'll keep my question brief. Is there a gendered aspect to the inadequate labor demand that needs specific redressal? Do we look at boosting labor demand across the board? I like to think there's some sort of veil that we're refusing to pierce when it comes to the gendered aspect of labor demand specifically. There's something happening on the demand side that disproportionately impacts women and the sexual and gender minorities that requires different sorts of redressal than just increasing job creation or boosting labor demand. Is there any?
So I'm not a big fan of these gendered jobs in general. So I don't think that there is any fundamental difference in capabilities of men and women, or for any gender for that matter. So it's the problem really comes from the employer's side. They think that these jobs are more suitable for women or are more suitable for men, right? So that's when at the point of hiring they would prefer men for a certain job as opposed to women. But it's not as though if they hired women, women would not be able to do it. That's not the point. So if you look at toll roads in Karnataka, you'll find lots of women sitting at toll booths, handing out tickets, but not in Haryana. So if women were fundamentally incapable of being toll booth workers, then why are they there in Karnataka and not in Haryana, right? So I would say increase the number of arenas in which both men and women can work, alongside, think of how gender bias can be fought and mitigated, and when women apply for jobs, it's harder to keep women out when lots of women are applying for jobs actually. So even in a place like Delhi, you have started to notice, women driving taxis, women at petrol pumps, women at toll booths. It's not as much as in the south, but it's started to change.
Hi, over here. So you made a statement earlier saying that I'm not exonerating companies, and then you made a point towards referring to Wipro's excellent returnship policy that they have. And perhaps I'm misunderstanding you here, but it seems to be a bit of a contradiction because you seem to be making an appeal to norms, in this case, organizational norms. And I was just curious if you could enumerate some economic policies or incentives to change organizational behavior in specific sectors. So for example, we are here in Bangalore for the tech sector. What are some of the policies?
I'm sorry if I sounded like I was exonerating companies. I was not at all. In fact, last 2 years I've been working with companies, trying to tell them, in fact now I'm planning a bigger study about exposing hiring managers to their own biases, right? So doing some bias studies and showing them this is what you actually believe in, things like that. That's not going to be easy, but I'm trying. So there's absolutely no question of exonerating anybody. Even for what I was only trying to say is that if you look at the sum total of all enterprises in India, the organizations like Wipro, Infosys, et cetera, are at the top tiny sliver of people who provide employment, because these are large corporations. They are the ones who can actually be put to task, and because they can bring about change in the enterprise. Think of a small enterprise that hires 5 people or 6 people, and then tell that the owner of that enterprise to give maternity leave to the one woman that he might hire, or 2 women, or give a 1-year childcare leave and keep paying her on that. That small employers don't have that bandwidth. So does it mean that women should not get any benefits in small enterprises? Absolutely not. So how do you solve this problem? That's where I was saying that the state has to come in. Large corporations, absolutely they must be held to account. There have to be policies. There is a whole set of, there's evidence from other countries. There are, International Labour Organization has norms about what constitutes a good workplace, which relates to a whole lot of provision of services, about how people are treated, about non-discriminatory behavior inside organizations, and absolutely that must be applied, without doubt. And there should be, laws, there should be arbitration, there should be a facility for the workers to complain if none of these norms are met. Workplace safety, workplace harassment, provisions of toilet, common rooms, etc., leave policies, all kinds of things. I mean, I can give you a whole list of things that companies must do. So there's no question of exonerating anybody.
You want the government to mandate?
No, the
this?
companies must do them inside their companies. There should be laws that mandate that if you have so many employees, these are all the services that you have to provide. Why not? Why is it not an economic argument? It is very much an economic argument.
I think we can take the follow-up maybe after the...
One last question.
Hi. So you made an excellent point about looking more at the demand side of things rather than norms and trying to improve the women labor force participation. But I just So I just thought of one example and where I just wanted to understand the trend over there. So if you look at China, you briefly mentioned China. So before, post their economic reformation, when they opened up a lot more to the markets and improving the material conditions, so the female workforce participation is somewhere around 63. But if you look at the data around 1980s, when China it didn't open up to the market and the demand side of the economy, it was somewhere around, I think, more than 80%. And the same thing if you compare with USA during its great boom period of the mid-90s, it's somewhere around its 50s. So can we effectively draw that conclusion that looking at the demand side of things or focusing more on the material conditions without looking or working on improving the norms or changing the norms can actually motivate in increasing the labor participation of women?
The question is what I said to Rosa in the beginning. If there is a vicious cycle between norms and between the supply side, I won't say only norms, but between the supply side and demand side factors, where does it break? How do you break it? Either you say this is life and it's just going to continue like this, so nothing to be done. But if you think that something can be changed, what is actionable? What can be changed? And how have people's mindsets changed over the decades, over centuries in other countries? How have people's mindsets changed in India in relation to female education, in relation to the total fertility rate, infant mortality rate, maternal, how have these norms changed? Was it due to extensive programs delivered to one person at a time? Did that happen in China? My reading of Chinese history is no. Did that happen in the United States? Again, my reading of the American history is no. What contributed to a massive increase in women entering paid work in Europe in the around the time of the First World War? Did people go around house to house saying, you must send your women out to paid work? No. It was the flu epidemic and the First World War, which resulted in very high rates of male mortality, where the women had no choice but to go out into paid work to sustain their families. And that's when the trend of increasing female labor force participation started. So the change happened because material circumstances changed. That doesn't mean that norms are not important. Of course they are. But how did norms change? That's the question I'm asking.
Thank you so much, Ashwini. It's always wonderful listening to you. Thank you for taking the time to come to Bangalore and deliver this lecture. Thank you to all of you for joining us today evening. Thanks. Bye. Have a nice weekend.